All right, let's take a look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18a. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. Because of this, I rejoice. All right, let's take a look at the passage in more detail. First of all, you notice that I've structured this here, and because we see that there's like, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, and then there's that's mirrored down here. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up troubles. And then in the middle, there's sort of the other way that people preach Christ, which is out of goodwill, out of love, knowing that I'm put here in defense of the gospel. So there's like these negative uh, bad motives, poor motives, as Paul will call them later on sort of 15 and 17. And then in the middle here is the positive motives for which people should be preaching the gospel. And then at the end, he says, well, what does it matter, right? He sort of comes down to his point at the end. Either way, Christ is preached, and I rejoice. So we can first take a look at the middle. I don't think we have to say too much about this. Others, so some preach Christ, right? If you remember back in verse 14, Paul was saying, hey, people have been emboldened to preach the gospel. They've seen me in chains, and they see my courage, and they see that I continue to preach boldly, and they themselves are inspired by that, so they preach boldly. And when they do that, they preach out of goodwill, and they do so out of love. They're concerned about Paul. They want to continue his mission. They are preaching Christ for the right motives. But on the other hand, we have those who preach Christ in a different way. It's difficult to understand exactly why are these people preaching Christ if they're Paul's opponents, and then why is Paul sort of large-hearted about it? Doesn't sort of attack them. He rejoices at the end. And it's hard to like totally reconstruct what's going on from the historical perspective, but there are some things that are clues in the text that can give us some hint of what's going on. So the key thing here is Paul's concerned about the motives, right? He's whether false motives are true. So he's talking about false. So at the core of this, there's false motivations, and these false motivations are envy and rivalry and selfish ambition. In other words, people are preaching Christ, they have some sort of rivalry with Paul, and we don't exactly know why. Like, why is there this rivalry, envy with Paul? He's the greatest guy in town. I mean, I sort of think you can imagine this scenario where there's a group of pastors in an area, and pastors are human, and as much as we all say we have the same mission, unfortunately, it's true that there can be rivalry and envy, and maybe this was coming out of just their own, like they wanted to be the best preacher on the block and Paul was more effective or something like that. Or maybe there were some theological differences. We'll see they're not poor because Paul still says they're preaching the gospel, but there might be some reasons why there's conflict or contention between. But either way, they would maybe see Paul, he's in prison. He's now is our chance to sort of strike and build our own tribe. Everybody can see that we're the best. So there's some kind of false motivation in their preaching where they're trying to get ahead. They have this ambitious streak, and they're seeing Paul's imprisonment as a way to finally get away ahead. So regardless, there's some sort of false motives going on. The second thing that we can see is they're still, as I said, they're still preaching Christ. This is not like the situation with the Galatians where Paul says these are false teachers. They're preaching another gospel that they should go all the way and emasculate themselves, right? It's a really strong language. Here, Paul is saying, hey, Christ is preached. Regardless if it's true or false motives, they're still preaching Christ. So there's a core element to the gospel here that is true and that Paul is glad is getting out there, even through these imperfect means. And he says, these are people that are trying to stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. This kind of gives a hint that these are probably opponents of Paul's in Rome, not in Philippi. In other words, Paul isn't warning the Philippians, look out for these false teachers. He's trying to give an example, or he's illustrating the point that even when there are, um, even what other people mean for harm, God is going to use for good. So Paul's imprisonment is leading to the expansion, extension of the gospel in Rome, all throughout the world, right? So Paul is glad, but they're trying to cause trouble for him in Rome. Likely, they see this as somehow a way of hurting Paul or Paul's mission or ministry or his status or whatever it might be. Okay, now Paul says, what does it matter? Listen, these people are preaching Christ. They have these terrible motives. They even want to cause trouble for me. Maybe they're bad mouthing him. But at the end of the day, what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. See, his rivals, as it were, are not necessarily rivals from his perspective because he's viewing the world through the lens of Christ. So if at the end of the day Christ is preached, he is going to rejoice. They, on the other hand, are viewing their mission through themselves and through Paul and who is the best, who is the most effective, whatever it might be. So their view of looking at this is all wrong. Whereas Paul says, listen, I'm just concerned about whether Christ is preached. If it comes through my rivals, so be it. But because of this, I rejoice. Because of this, I rejoice. All right. I want to sort of bring us back here, remind us of what we saw in verses 12 to 14. This is all about how God is bringing about his good purposes, regardless of the humans' desires, right? Humans want to they have bad motivations. They might want to cross the gospel, hinder the gospel, preach the gospel out of false motives, right? So Paul's imprisonment is leading to, him being able to preach the gospel in Rome, and then also brothers and sisters becoming confident and proclaiming the gospel without fear. Now, here we expand on that, proclaim without fear. Some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. Some preach Christ out of love. Either way, Christ is preached. Therefore, Paul rejoices. Finally, for our reflection, I kind of want to ask this. Have you seen, or how can you see, or how have you seen God accomplishing his purposes, even in situations where humans have flawed motives? And maybe to personalize that too. How have you seen God moving, or have you seen God work and accomplish his purposes in your life, even when your motives were less than pure, and you still saw God move and act? All of this really comes down for Paul. He's got a very big view of God, that God is going to accomplish his purposes, sometimes through humans, sometimes in spite of humans, and in spite of their motivations. And for that, I think we can, with Paul, rejoice. Thanks for watching.